In a second, I'll provide a bit more of a formal introduction for Carol Ryff, as if anyone in the room needs this introduction, but I'll provide it anyway. But before I do, I simply want to add 2 pieces of insight into why I wanted to ask Carol to serve in this role, in particular, why she came to mind in this particular role. And I don't expect anyone to have known these because they're in many ways personal and anecdotal, but I want to share them anyway to kind of reveal and disclose why she fits this role so well for us. The first thing is this, is that when we were putting together the conference and organizing, thinking of speakers and who we wanted to attend, Carol had a conversation with you, and early on, some of the suggestions and thoughts and ideas that you had actually became very formative, and they started to influence the rest of what we're going to do this week. And so it became very influential for us in a lot of ways. And something that happened along the way was we thought about the venue, and we moved from Ithaca out to California, and most people were completely content with that. And something about Ithaca in October and versus this area in October, we're content. But Carol was not as much so, and for several reasons perhaps. But one thing in particular that she shared with me is that one thing she felt would be missing is the presence of students. And if this had been at Cornell, we would have invited undergraduate students, graduate students to participate and be audience members and participate in the conversation as well. And because of our venue change, they weren't here. And that mattered to you, mattered to me, and I made note of that. And that's a big part of what we're trying to do. And so we thought this makes perfect sense for you to open our conversation today, because we thought that with that spirit and that sort of focus and attention on that group of people is something we want to accentuate. The second thing is this, and I think there's only probably a handful of people in the room who would know this, but a couple of years ago, some people in this room attended a conference called Purpose 360. Okay, so a couple people know. Purpose 360, it was a conference put on by a group called Echoing Green out of New York City, and they sort of organized a theme around asking a group of people this question: is there an emerging field of purpose? Right? Bringing people from different walks of life together, academics, people working in industries and for-profit, non-profit companies, social entrepreneurs, putting them into a room together and see what happens when they start talking about purpose. It's kind of an interesting theme in which we would organize a conference. But more interesting perhaps was sort of the venue. It took place in a museum. And it was a kind of interesting thing for I don't typically attend conferences in museums, but I should, because I had a really good time. It was a really nice setup. But one thing that was really notable was the conference began with speakers in front of a whiteboard. The entire front of this museum was lined with white paper, and they gave us markers. And they sort of organized the whiteboard by decades. And they said, come up to the front and write on the board anything that you think has impacted the way we think about purpose now. So any social movements, any scholarship, any ideas, put them in their place and when they happened. And soon this whiteboard was just filled with people's ideas of movements and inventions and scholarship, books, movies, different things that people sort of recruited, they think of, said that's what really sort of is influencing our ideas of what purpose in life really is. It was a fascinating sort of transition in a way to engage with this concept. And I sort of shied away from this because as an introvert, it's sort of uncomfortable to be up there and you have to tell people why you wrote something down, and I don't draw very well. So it's sort of an uncomfortable situation. But I then built up the courage and I went there and I put 2 things on the board. The first thing I put was the election of Barack Obama, because I thought that sort of, I could see how purpose was sort of manufactured or constructed, or at least assisted there by sort of engaging people who had not thought of themselves in the future in the political realm in this way. For the first time, they might be able to. And that was sort of an insight that I had at the time. But the other thing that I put on the board was the name Carol Ryff. And the reason I did that is because in our early engagement with the scholarship on purpose in life, the thing that made one of the largest impressions on me was that purpose wasn't discussed as this sort of nicety. You had discussed it as a component of psychological well-being, that to know how people are faring in life, you need to know a lot about them, but one thing you need to know is the extent to which they feel like their life has purpose. And that sort of positioning of purpose as a component of psychological well-being, I thought was a big deal. And so I wanted to invite you to become our speaker, so thank you for accepting. So I will mention this. Our speaker tonight, of course, is Dr. Carol Ryff, who is the director of the Institute on Aging and the Hilldale Professor of Psychology at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. She also directs the Midas, which of course the midlife in the US is a national study of Americans, which has become a major forum for integrative, multidisciplinary studies of health and well-being, as well as a parallel study in Japan, known as the MIDJA, Midlife in Japan. Dr. Ryff received her PhD in psychology from the Pennsylvania State University. Dr. Ryff is well known for identifying 6 dimensions of psychological well-being: autonomy, environmental mastery, personal growth, positive relations with others, self-acceptance, and of course, purpose in life. She also conducts research on positive health and the connections between psychological well-being and biology. In addition, she investigates resilience in terms of the recovery of health and well-being in the face of adversity. The list of publications, rewards received, grants received, and accomplishments are just a bit too daunting to list in this time we have left, and why when you're here with us tonight. So if you could join me in welcoming Dr. Carol Ryff.
Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. Thank you for that really lovely introduction, which I very much appreciate. I'm really excited to be here for this conference. I'm on sabbatical this year, and I'm trying to protect my time very carefully on sabbatical, where I'm kind of sequestering myself away up in the San Juan Islands, north of here. But this was a conference I did not want to miss, because I really appreciate the lifespan scope of the conference. Also, this is a conference where I'm able to reconvene with people from the distant times in my life and some new folks I have begun to know and collaborate with. So the whole topic, the focus was irresistible to me. So I'm really thrilled to be here. I wish I could wave a magic wand and you would all be in your jammies and comfortable and have your feet up on a hassock, but I will do my best to keep you engaged and be provocative, and if anybody looks like they're fading out, I might come around and pinch you. Okay, so my plan is to just briefly tell you, how do I think about purpose in life as a part of eudaimonic well-being. I spent a lot of time making my way through various literatures to try to come up with this new model of well-being. And I want to just say a little bit about kind of the foundational ideas there, because I think they're so beautiful and we can all be so enriched by them. I'll just say a little bit about current empirical work. Then I'm going to tell you about what have we learned from recent studies about what happens to purpose in life in middle and later adulthood. There is some sort of a negative story on the one hand, that there is evidence that it really declines for some people, but there's a lot of variability. And among those individuals who don't show decline in things like purpose and personal growth, we are beginning to see amazing health benefits. And I very much like the translational emphasis of this conference. So I'm going to end with comments about promoting eudaimonia, intervention studies, that's another way of talking about translational studies, and some ideas about the role that I think educational opportunities play in this, and even the arts and humanities. Okay, so when I was in graduate school, Rich Lerner would know about, because he was one of my professors at Penn State, and one of my first papers was written with him. I was being trained in lifespan developmental psychology and social gerontology, and people were talking about successful aging, but their indicators of successful aging were not very inspiring. They were asking people questions about how satisfied with life are you, how happy are you, and then if you would scratch beneath the surface a little bit to try to figure out, well, why are they asking those questions? There was really not much there, which is another way of saying there was no real theoretical or conceptual foundation. And meanwhile, when I'd been an undergraduate and was, reading philosophy and taking courses in theories of personality, I'm reading all of this great existential, humanistic, human development stuff, which you can see at the bottom of this figure here. I mean, I loved reading the Jungian ideas about individuation and even Maslow's ideas about self-actualization. I mean, some of it just goes on and on and on. but there were, compelling, I appreciated the motivation behind all of these people's efforts to articulate the upside of the human condition. And so the 6 components of well-being that I ended up focusing on basically represented points of convergence in these different perspectives, which gave me, I didn't want to spend my entire career running after Erik Erikson's stage model, even though I worked with that, as that was my first empirical study in graduate school. And I love the idea of generativity and ego integrity, but I wanted to do something that I felt might actually have a little more gravitas, that would come by trying to figure out where these people are talking about similar things. And so these 6 components, and I'll give you some visual imagery for what they're about, represent the points of convergence in this model. And the hand there is to symbolize reaching for something new. I would be remiss if I didn't draw some specific attention to Viktor Frankl. This book, I think, is one of the most important books in human history, which has been read by millions of people all over the planet for good reason. I've read it 3 times myself. I give it to people actually when they're suffering difficult experiences in their lives. And I don't know if we can move something, but I guess you can see most of this down here. In any case, I would say Viktor Frankl's amazing insights in this book, there were so many of them, but one was an insight about his spiritual freedom, which is to say he could not control what was happening to him during his 3-year experience in the Nazi concentration camps, but what he could control was his reaction to it. And he chose. This is an ultimate existential act. He chose to find meaning and purpose in it. And then he moved into the future part, where he actually envisioned himself. He's a psychiatrist by training, so he envisions himself in the future giving a lecture about this experience in the camps, which he went on to do. And then he develops logotherapy, which actually gets a lot more attention among European clinicians than in the US. There's a lot of emphasis there. But logotherapy is essentially about finding meaning and purpose in adversity, which I think is a beautiful idea. I also need to say, I didn't start out at the beginning reading Aristotle, but somewhere along the way, as these words eudaimonia and hedonia kept cropping up, I actually read the Nicomachean Ethics, which is not a book about well-being. It's a book about ethics and virtue. But I mean, the insights in the book are so astonishing. Victor Strucker and I were talking about this earlier this evening. It was how is it that, that many years ago, over 2,000 years ago, he was asking all the right questions and just coming up with such thoughtful answers that required such deep penetrating thought. So he's asking, what is the highest of all human goods? And this is where we get the word eudaimonia, which he defined as activity of the soul in accord with virtue. And then he pushes himself to articulate what then is the highest virtue. And that's where we get to the essence of eudaimonia. It's a kind of self-realization where we know our daemon, we know our inner spirit, and that takes work, but we then work to achieve the best that is within us. And I wouldn't claim that I think I have the best possible empirical handles on these ideas, but personal growth, which sounds a little more like the California counterculture, movement, it is really very eudaimonic in its meaning. And purpose in life, I think, really enriches it. And those two, I would say, of the 6 components of well-being, are the ones that were really carving new territory in a lot of contemporary research. These are the definitions. I'm not going to put this up for too long, but these definitions matter, because these definitions were the basis for writing the self-report items. I followed the Jackson model of personality assessment, the construct-oriented approach to personality assessment, where you push yourself to start with some clear definitions. These definitions came out of the underlying theories, and then with a group of undergraduates in my crummy little office in the Brogdon Psychology Building in Wisconsin, we wrote items. We wrote tons of items. And then we did all kinds of item analyses, and that's why these scales have withstood a lot of rigorous psychometric scrutiny. So I'm not going to say too much about the other scales because I'm just going to focus on those two for tonight, but I'm blown away with how much impact these measures have had. Because I had a hell of a time getting them published in the first place. I mean, and that's often what happens, I think, when you're doing something new and other people who are in prominent positions don't want new things out there on the table. There are now over 500 articles that have been published using these measures, which have been translated to more than 30 different languages. Some of those studies I reviewed in this review article that I published in 2014, and I kind of organized that review around these primary topics, and I've highlighted in yellow the ones that are of primary interest for me here tonight. As a lifespan developmentalist, I was very interested in how do these things change as people move across the life course. And lots of, I love the fact that this work has really gotten way into work and family life. This is really contextually grounded work on well-being. But I'm going to focus more on what have we learned about well-being and health and biomarkers and then intervention and clinical studies. But I asked myself in writing that review article, why has so much interest been generated in these measures? And I think it's because these, so when I was in graduate school, I learned how to use words like phenomenology, and I even read Husserl, and I realized, I really care about subjective experience, which is often dissed in many, especially biomedical, harder core neuroscience domains. Self-report is just, found fault with endlessly, but I care about subjective experience. I really want to get a handle on how people are making sense of their own lives, and I think that these indicators have done a reasonable job of capturing what it means to be human, to strive, to be proactive, to make meaning, and as articulated by Aristotle, to pursue the highest good that is within us. Those are kinds of ideals of human functioning. Now, one year on my birthday, Dov Shmotkin, who's a wonderful clinical psychologist at the University of Tel Aviv, sent me pictures to kind of illustrate the 6 dimensions. Dov's wife has a birthday on the same day as my birthday, and for some reason he always remembers my birthday, but it was just the most lovely gift. And my favorite picture actually was the one he chose for Purpose in Life, which is a painting you could take a look at a museum in Rome. It's Raphael's School of Athens. It's an incredible painting about that astonishing period in human history, Hellenic culture, and all of the great thinkers that came out of that period. I thought that was a beautiful way of capturing purpose in life. Here's his imagery for personal growth, making the most of your talents and capacities. And initially, I didn't like this part. It was just like, no, I don't like this like going down. And then I started aging. And I'm standing in front of undergraduates teaching them about normal aging. And normal aging is absolutely about biological decline, but that does not need to translate to a loss of self-realization and continuing capacities for making the most of whatever you have. So that's personal growth. The most universally endorsed aspect in all of the 6 components is having good quality relations with others, la maison en fait. You probably can't see this, but it's all about social interaction. This is a pretty nice image of autonomy, which my Japanese colleagues, made clear to me is the most Western of all of the components of well-being. Marching to your own drummer is not really a big idea in collectivist, interdependent cultures, but it's certainly prominent in a lot of theories of development in this cultural context. Environmental mastery is kind of like sense of control, but it's actually got more of a kind of person-environment fit component into it than does sense of control. And I love this imagery for self-acceptance. Okay, so we know there's a mountain of research on self-esteem. Self-acceptance is deeper and richer. And the reason it's deeper and richer is because of the Jungian idea of the shadow. And that true self-acceptance is not just about feeling good about yourself. It's actually about understanding your liabilities, your warts, knowing how to work with them so that they're not getting in the way of your self-realization or undermining other people. Okay, so some glimpses on what we've learned about these components of well-being from the Midas study. Thank you, Tony, for mentioning the Midas study, which stands for Midlife in the US. Bill and Ann were there when the Midas study was taking off and played important roles in it. It was originally funded by the MacArthur Foundation Midlife Research Network, and then we got NIA to get behind it. We just got the third large grant from NIA that Steve Cole is involved in for carrying the study forward for another 5 years. The study began with 7,000 people aged 25 to 74 across the United States. Embedded within that was a national sample of twins. We now have over 12,000 people in the study because we have refreshed, grown the sample over time. We have also augmented the sample with 2 oversamples of African Americans from Milwaukee, Wisconsin, because we really wanted to have a strong emphasis on race and health in this kind of biopsychosocial extravaganza. So the study is really flourishing. This brochure is from the website. We are collecting massive amounts of data on all kinds of things. But what was the great novelty of the study relative to other population-based studies at the time was to bring in all of this psychosocial stuff, which prior to Midas was being studied for the most part in small, select community samples. The developmentalists, the social psychologists, the personality psychologists had not made enough inroads into fields of epidemiology, sociology, and demography to get those kinds of things into big national studies. So this is our website. The data are publicly available. People here, some people are using the Midas data. I waved the flag about how much is coming out of this study because that's important to maintain the funding of the study. We now have over 754 publications and more than 35,000 unique users of the data. It's one of the most frequently used data sets on the planet. And if you go to the website and click on for researchers, then you get to a tab that says publications. And you will see these are the categories of publications that have come out of Midas without the numbers. Those are changing all the time. But this is just to say all kinds of things are being generated from this study, including over 150 publications just on the topic of well-being. And I want to draw attention to the fact that in the Midas study, we have some really interesting measures about early life experience, relationship with mother and father in childhood, family, economic status in childhood. Many people are linking those early life indicators to what's going on in midlife and beyond. So some of the studies that we did with the baseline data, this was the first study anywhere that put eudaimonia and hedonia together. Hedonic well-being was basically some questions about life satisfaction, positive and negative affect. My scales were the eudaimonic measures. What we basically showed in this study is they are related constructs. Of course, they're all about well-being, but they are distinct. And we assembled the evidence to basically say, because there were people out there who would say, why do we need to be asking so many questions about well-being? Can't we just whittle it down to like 3 good ones? And this was basically evidence saying, you know, there's really a lot here that needs to be kept track of in the same way that we do not try to whittle down the negative side of psychological experience to 3 items. Why should we do the same thing with the positive side? Okay, so then we started, even in the baseline data, we started seeing some evidence of cross-sectional aging declines in purpose in life and personal growth. And I didn't like that. I mean, I didn't want to see that. I didn't even expect to see that, but there it was. So this is from the first look of the Midas 1 data. I just want to draw attention to the green line is personal growth. This is data for women. The purple line is data for men. You see these cross-sectional decrements. You see the same cross-sectional decrements for males. Subsequently, in the Women's Health Initiative, which involves over 80,000 respondents in the US, you also see age-related declines in purpose in life and personal growth. But this is the really important publication that actually shows longitudinal decline in these measures over time. This study combines data from the National Survey of Families and Households, from the Midas study, and from the Wisconsin longitudinal study. So there's something really going on here about these declines, which leads to the question, why? Why do we see age-related decline in purpose in life? And I think it has to do with, although I don't have empirical support for this, what the sociologist, Matilda Riley in particular, would call the structural lag problem, which is our social institutions lag behind the added years of life that many people are now experiencing. So we don't have sufficient opportunities for meaningful activities and involvements. Some older people are figuring out how to create those things for themselves nonetheless. And that's why I draw attention here to the fact that some older people remain engaged and purposeful. There's a lot of within age group variability. And among those who do, we're seeing amazing benefits in terms of longevity and health. This is a publication from Midas showing that purpose in life predicts mortality. Those with higher purpose live longer. Earlier evidence from a study called the Rush Memory and Aging Project, which is a community-based epidemiological study over a 6-year period, showed that purpose in life predicts longer lives. And this is carefully done epidemiology where there's all kinds of control variables in the model to rule out confounding explanations. And this just came out in 2016. It's a meta-analysis of 10 prospective studies involving over 136,000 people around the globe, showing that higher purpose is associated with reduced all-cause mortality. In Japan, there is a kind of comparable concept called ikigai, which is what makes life worth living. So that's how you can actually look at the long-term impact of ikigai in Japanese society. The Rush Memory and Aging Project took purpose in life in the direction of showing reduced risk for Alzheimer's disease and mild cognitive impairment over this 6-year period. And that study, amazingly, remember the nun study where they got people to donate their brains after they died? This is also a study where people donate their brains after they die, which means they can do post-mortem analysis of degree of pathology in the brain after death. And these graphs, when you go way out on the x-axis there, you're looking at high levels of organic pathology in the brain, measured in different ways, neurofibrillary plaques and tangles and so on. And on the vertical axis, what you're looking at is how were they functioning cognitively while they were still alive. And the two lines above the graph are basically saying at high levels of organic pathology, those who are walking around with higher levels of purpose in life are still functioning well cognitively. Now, those are findings that obviously call out for an explanation that would require going into other neural mechanisms, but it's amazing research, I think. And then, Eric, this is your slide. Eric and Victor, amazing work being done with the health and retirement study out of Michigan, another major aging study. Eric was just an unbelievable go-getter. I'm a graduate student. These things were all published by Eric Kim when he was in graduate school. Victor was involved, showing that purpose in life reduces risk of myocardial infarction among adults with coronary heart disease. It reduces risk of stroke. And I love this other paper showing that purpose in life predicts greater use of preventive health behaviors. Steve, this is your slide. I'm not going to say anything about it other than to say I'm thrilled that Steve Cole brought all of his intelligence and insight and talent in studying gene expression in context of adversity into this world of well-being, and he has generated amazing findings that he will explain, not me. Okay. We are also linking purpose in life to biomarkers. Purpose in life predicts lower levels of allostatic load, which is this summary index of biological risk factors 10 years later. This is a paper where we went after the question of living well with medical comorbidities. So if you live long enough, you're going to have chronic conditions. That's just part of normal aging. And chronic conditions, comorbidity, fuel further inflammatory processes that can increase your risk for even more health problems. But having higher well-being protects against these effects. So the inflammatory markers that are being graphed here are C-reactive protein on the bottom and interleukin-6 on the top. And you can see we got these effects for positive relations with others, purpose, and also positive affect. And the two lines in the graph are basically saying if you go out to the far end on chronic conditions and you want to look at what are the levels of the inflammatory markers, the levels of the inflammatory markers differ depending on people's reports of these different aspects of well-being. So that having more of these aspects of well-being is associated with reduced levels of these inflammatory markers. Midas has a neuroscience project, so we're looking at eudaimonia in the brain. This is not a Midas study. It preceded the Midas work. People are in the neuroimaging magnet, and it's about emotion regulation and what's happening in the brain in emotion regulation. So that people who are faster to evaluate negative information show greater activation of the amygdala. But that's not really great news. What really is interesting news here is that higher well-being, eudaimonic well-being as a composite, is a modulator of that effect. So that people who have higher eudaimonic well-being are slower to evaluate the negative information. They show less amygdala activation and increased activation of the anterior cingulate cortex, which they interpret this way. They say that people high in PWB recruit the ventral anterior cingulate cortex when confronted with aversive stimuli, manifest reduced activity in subcortical regions like the amygdala, and appraise the information as less salient as reflected in slower evaluative speed. This is a study from Midas focused on purpose in life, showing that purpose in life predicts better brain-based emotion regulation, measured in terms of smaller eye blink response after negative provocation. It's a very in the world of affective neuroscience, it's a very rigorous study because they measured both emotional reactivity and then recovery to the emotional reactivity. This is a neuroimaging study with the Midas sample that is focused more on reward circuitry in the brain and eudaimonic well-being and cortisol, so reaching across all these different levels. So the main finding is that people who show sustained engagement of something called the ventral striatum, which is the reward circuitry. And by the way, I've been telling my neuroscience colleagues for years, tell me where the meaning circuitry is. And they haven't given me an answer to that yet. Okay, so wonderful, wonderful, thank you. So this is basically showing that people who hang on to the activation of the reward circuitry in response to positive stimuli for a longer period of time have higher levels of eudaimonic well-being, and that pattern of sustained engagement of reward circuitry and eudaimonic well-being is also reflected in better patterns of daily salivary cortisol, measured both in terms of area under the curve and the diurnal progression. I know I'm going through this stuff really fast, but it's late, and I'm happy to send the slide file to everybody who's interested. I did want to just draw attention to this, because this kind of comes back to Viktor Frankl in some ways, which is this really interesting phenomenon that when we go after these more novel aspects of well-being having to do with meaning and purpose and growth, we are assembling evidence to show that it is sometimes in the context of adversity where we see better profiles of these things. So we have, as I said, we have oversamples of African Americans in the Midas study, but even before we had oversamples, we published this from the Midas baseline study, status inequalities, perceived discrimination, and eudaimonic well-being. This is the key thing. Do the challenges of minority life hone purpose and growth? Because the main finding is that it was minority status, not majority status, that was the positive predictor of eudaimonic well-being, underscoring this idea of psychological strengths in the face of race-related adversity. Then Corey Keyes picks up on these ideas. He does wonderful things with the Midas data where he puts together assessments of both mental distress and well-being, and flourishing for him is defined as the presence of well-being and the absence of mental distress. And this is a study called the Black and White Paradox in Health, showing that blacks have higher rates of flourishing than whites. Really interesting ideas. Thanks to David Williams, Midas was, I believe, the first national study to have really high quality measures of perceived discrimination in daily life. And this was a recent publication from Midas showing that racial discrimination among blacks is associated with greater use of alternative health care to cope with barriers experienced in institutional settings. Tom Fuller-Roll, who's from the Human Development Program at Cornell, wonderful findings showing that perceived discrimination is associated with better diurnal cortisol, that is, steeper downward decline in African Americans compared to whites. Again, suggesting this idea that the awareness of racism in daily life may actually confer some protective benefits. Okay, so I'm getting to the promoting of well-being part. This was started, yeah.
Sorry, but I have to ask this question. Sure. Why? Why do you think purpose in life has all of these epidemiologic effects?
Because I think the meaning-making activities, the goal orientations are a part of how people are phenomenologically invested in their lives, enacting their lives, realizing their potential, and that's instantiated in the brain and the physiology. I mean, I think it's very mind-body, and we're trying to figure out what the mechanisms are. You don't find that a satisfactory answer?
No, because tell me how it relates to evolution. How did we evolve being protected by purpose in life?
I think that's a pseudo question, because that's based on the idea.
It's not a pseudo question.
That's based on the idea that somehow evolution precedes development. That you're assuming that there's evolution that gives you something, and then there's development. Development itself constructs development. You don't need a priori evolutionary genetic mechanism to somehow give you the bases of human function. So you're sounding like you're an evolutionary developmental psychologist here, and that is just a flawed conception of human development.
Interesting.
Okay, great, let's activate. Wonderful, I love this activation. I would also just say that Eric Kim's K Award, that he, so there are other mechanisms that you could point to besides the brain and the physiology. Health behaviors. So people who are more purposefully engaged in their lives. I mean, I actually think if you think about the obesity and sedentary epidemics in America, my guess is a lot of that reflects lives that do not embody high degrees of purpose and engagement.
Is a key word.
Yeah.
Talk about tomorrow. Oh, not tomorrow.
Yeah, okay. So anyway, this is just basically saying Giovanni Fava, who is a psychiatrist at the University of Bologna in Italy, heard me speak about this stuff years ago. And he treats people who suffer from depression and anxiety. And, cognitive behavioral therapy is very focused on maladaptive cognitions, how you interpret negative experiences. And his idea was when people are in the residual phase of depression, so that they're not, really totally debilitated by it, but they're at risk for falling back into depression, they need positive experiences. And so he developed well-being therapy, which is really low tech. It's about keeping daily diaries of positive experience. You can't use your diary to ruminate. And then you come in and you meet with the clinician about your positive experiences, and that's where you would get guidance about ways in which your thought patterns might prematurely curtail your experiences of the positive because you think you don't deserve it or it's unfamiliar or whatever. Anyway, it works. It works, and it works over a 6-year period. So this basically showed differences in the proportions still in remission. These are the people who got cognitive behavioral therapy that included well-being therapy, and these were people who were just getting standard clinical management. For this crowd, you're likely to be far more interested in the work that Chiara Ruini, who worked with Giovanni Fava. She now has her own independent career. She took this stuff in the direction of prevention with children and adolescents in schools in Italy, where you are actually teaching these skills of well-being therapy to adolescents in schools. A lot of it was focused on trying to prevent the development of depression in adolescent girls. And Chiara and I have a recently published paper in the Wiley Handbook of Positive Clinical Psychology, where we review a lot of the literature on using eudaimonia to improve lives, either in clinical contexts for treating depression and anxiety, or in these preventive contexts, including in Wisconsin, where we are doing this program called Lighten Up for older people in the community. And what we do is we teach older people, it's an 8-week intervention, we teach them about what well-being is and why it's important. And then the classes actually focus on ways in which they can learn how to, aging is, tough. There are a lot of losses and difficulties experienced in aging. So it is teaching them skills to basically, I think, negotiate the negative and also rev up their commitment to seeking and savoring positive experience. Okay, but what is missing in Midas? This is getting me down to the finale. why would I ask this question? I must be, insane to even want to consider this, but I actually think despite the wide disciplinary scope of Midas, we don't know anything about this stuff. People's encounters with the arts, and this is perhaps too autobiographical, but we're all influenced by the lives we have led, and I can only say that these things have been hugely sustaining to me in my life, especially during times of considerable difficulty. What you get out of great literature and poetry and film and dance, and there are other places on the globe, like in the UK, where the Royal Society for Public Health is in high gear going after this, with a big report they published on art, health, and well-being. So well-being has become a credible, empirically tractable topic in hardcore health fields, so that you can now be asking questions about what nurtures people's well-being. And I'm not saying these are the only things that nurture people's well-being, but this is certainly part of it for some people, and I think it needs to be studied. So this is just our picture of the disciplines that Midas integrates. It's phenomenal that we have actually been able to get scientists from across all of these different areas to interact with each other seriously and learn how to work with each other's variables. But again, that doesn't cover everything. And so in May of this last year, I hosted a conference in Madison on the arts, the sciences, and human betterment, reaching for integration, where we had museum curators, we had artists, we had scientists of different stripes, focusing on, there's a whole new field now called health humanities. This is an amazing book by John Dewey, Art as Experience. I mean, he probably has done, in many ways, the deepest thinking about how art affects us. This is a really thoughtful, sort of tedious academic book. I don't know how many people read Alain de Botton. I love his books. He doesn't cite anybody. He is kind of arrogant, but his books are spectacular. I mean, I think in many ways he gets it right. He is very erudite. He just doesn't play by the same rules that the rest of us do. And this is a fabulous book. This is even better, How Proust Can Change Your Life. Proust can teach you how to suffer successfully. And this book I absolutely love. This is by someone who's professor of literature at the University of Virginia. And he's like basically making this compelling argument about why students in higher education need to read great literature and what it can do for them. I want to draw attention to this book just out. You probably can't see this very well. I didn't get a very good slide of this, but it's edited by Donald Harward. It's called Wellbeing in Higher Education, A Strategy for Change and the Realization of Education's Greater Purpose. This book was the result of efforts initiated within the American Association of Colleges and Universities. In many ways, as an outsider participating in this and watching what was happening, I saw it as a kind of effort to revitalize the argument for a liberal education. But they're doing it with notably new oomph. And I wrote a chapter in the book on eudaimonic well-being and education, probing the connections, where I really was drawing attention to the fact that despite the use of education in almost all of our published studies, we know nothing about what kind of education people have. All we know is how many years. We don't know what kind of education they actually got. And then I went off into Mark Edmondson's work to basically say, I think there's some really great questions we should be asking in some of these big studies. So this is my summary. I'm at the end. I'm sorry if I've gone on too long. I'm here to say I think there's enough evidence in that we can conclude the story's not over, more needs to be done, but there's certainly a running start of evidence that purpose in life is good for health and longevity. I appreciate your question, Victor. We need to, why? What's behind it? The empirical evidence is there. We need to explain it. I tend to go down the road of wanting to understand it in mechanisms within the brain and the body, but health behaviors is a whole other angle. I think it's really worthwhile to emphasize that purpose growth in eudaimonia may be particularly relevant in the ethnic minority context, and I didn't put up my slides about this because there's not enough time, but I have also emphasized in many talks resilience in the context of socioeconomic adversity. So people who lack advanced educational attainment, people who don't have high incomes, who don't have high occupational status, these well-being measures are also protective buffers for them in reducing their risk of elevated inflammatory factors, for example. There certainly is evidence that eudaimonia can be promoted both in clinical interventions and in educational programs. And I think the arts may be key ingredients for nourishing, meaningful, fulfilling lives. And the arts will certainly take us beyond anything we could ever talk about with regard to evolutionary theory. I would like to end with this. I love this quote because it's a little perverse, I don't know, I love it. The purpose of life is to be defeated by greater and greater things. Thank you. Sure, I'm happy to, unless people want to, take off. Yes, please.
First of all, I'm so glad you're here because just like Anthony said, you're one of the reasons that I'm in this field, clearly. So it's so cool for you to fly through just a snapshot of this massive, amazing research program.
Yeah.
What I wanted to know is, since you're here, we're going to be having this whole few days on purpose in life, and one of the things in this field of well-being is a lot of the work is positive things related to positive things. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering what you found over the years where purpose in life, what it didn't relate to, and what you haven't published that's been interesting and surprising over the years.
Oh, wow. Yeah, those would be the unpublished findings. I think there have been so many of those unpublishable findings, I cannot possibly retrieve all of that. However, let me say this. It's been interesting to me the way this has evolved, which is to say, only in some of the studies that I summarized here, that this would be the studies that are not Midas. So Midas has all the measures. So that means in every instance, when we're looking at any of these things, we can basically say, is it just purpose? Or is it purpose and positive relations? And Midas has been the place where we have learned that purpose in life in numerous contexts, including in the neuroscience study, does kind of rise to the top. So that's more the interesting finding than where it hasn't worked. It is having, I guess, more impact in the empirical findings. Now, let me just say that for some of the other studies, like Eric, I can't remember how much is in HRS, but in many of the other studies, like the Rush Memory and Aging Project and HRS, they only have a subset of well-being measures. They didn't go after all of them. So it's hard to know. I think it's kind of fashionable now because come on, it's existentially meaningful. It's why were we studying it a long time ago? Yeah.
2 years ago, I was in Heidelberg, Germany, because Heidelberg and Mannheim wanted to become more purposeful. Huh. So we went out to this forest and to a monastery, and I was talking about purpose in life, and somebody raised their hand and said, Hitler had a purpose.
Yes, exactly.
It certainly did. ISIS has a purpose.
Exactly.
And one might say, well, they didn't have self-transcending purposes. They sure did. They were willing to blow themselves up.
Yeah.
So Tell me about this and whether we should encourage purpose. This is an existential question. This is a Nietzschean question, actually.
It is.
Whether you should basically slay the thou shalt dragon of thus spoke Zarathustra and pick out any kind of purpose. In other words, it's just like a cookbook. And I think David Brooks talks about this well in his Road to Character. He says we should be following existing religions, existing ways of thinking, because those are the cookbooks for us. And if you're a bad cook, you should stay out of the kitchen.
Incredibly disappointing. I found his book incredibly disappointing. He didn't deliver the goods on just about any front. I mean, I appreciate the fact that he translates a lot of science, but he does it in a kind of superficial way.
Regardless of whether the book is good.
But separate from that, the issue about malevolent purposes has been on the table since the beginning of this work. And for good reason, because we can think of extreme examples from human history where people were profoundly purposeful in wreaking havoc and destruction in the lives of others. That is where I think, and this is why we need Bill and Ann and other people, and I was saying to Ann when we were just talking at the beginning this evening, it's taken me a long time to figure out how fundamentally important it is to have an emphasis on ethics and virtue in all of this, which is where Aristotle started. So, and you know, all kinds of people have been doing that forever, but I think it's actually coming back in very interesting ways. So there is a wonderful university called the University of Humanistic Studies in Utrecht in the Netherlands. I mean, the Netherlands is just a really interesting country in terms of, you know, well, I don't have time to go into all of that, but they organized a conference on this. How is this for a spectacular topic for a conference? A meaningful life in a just society. Pretty impressive, right? Pretty impressive. So the point is, I think many people are pushing to bring, there is actually a whole new field called virtue ethics in response to utilitarian ethics or deontological ethics, which are about rules or about promoting the greatest. But virtue ethics is right out of Aristotle, and it is about leading good lives. And so people recognize that. They're writing books about it in many different walks of life. I'm pushing economists, as I was telling Ann, to get their butts in gear to focus on the other end. Like, why do economists not study greed and corruption? I mean, there's a massive field of health inequalities.
So what you're saying then is it's important to have a purpose, but we are who we choose to be, so we should be careful who we choose to be.
Yeah, and I'm not, you know, the danger of cranking up the upside of the human experience, which has been brought into high relief by the positive psychology movement, much of which I hold in high disregard, because it leaves out the negative. I mean, and it has, in many instances, no intellectual heft. So, you know, other people have heard me rant about that at other times, but we need to actually have these balanced perspectives. So, you know, I've given talks where I'm not only covering, you know, what are we thinking about well-being and how do we conceptualize it and how do we measure it. I put up Dante's Inferno because Dante's Inferno reminds us of all of the horrible sins that, you know, were prevalent in his era, and they're still with us. Gluttony and greed. I mean, it's astonishing to me. Even Adam Smith wrote incredibly about the problem of greed. And economists do not study it. I think they don't want to face up to it. They would much rather, in health inequalities research, all of the focus is on people at the bottom, people who are suffering. It's not about the malevolence of people at the top. Yeah.
Can I just ask quickly, again, thank you for your talk, and the amount of ground you covered, I think it sets us up well for the week. To switch gears slightly, I want to ask, do you think purpose is doing the same thing for people across the lifespan? Or at different developmental stages, would you predict different effects.
Oh, anybody who's a serious developmentalist who really thinks about the roles and responsibilities that we carry as we move across the life course, it has to be transformed, because of, so I do think it is transformed, but, we're talking a lot about purpose here tonight, but I thank you for the question, because what I wanted to come back to was the idea of eudaimonia with the emphasis on like self-realization. Making the most of your talents and capacities. And that is so interesting to study as people get old, because people lose certain capabilities as they age, but they can still, they can make choices. Paul Baltus would have called it selective optimization with compensation. So I think many of these, that's why my measures do not get at what is your purpose. We don't actually even know. That's why we can't be measuring some people who have malevolent purposes. It's more, do you have one? Do you have purpose? Do you have meaning? But the reason we wrote the items that way was so that we could actually make age comparisons. So you had to write about the kind of construct at a higher order abstract level, so that it was not anchored in my purpose is to do a good job raising my children, or my purpose is to do a good job, getting an education and finding, a life path in the work world. So I think purpose is transformational, but really important questions is when we look at these older people who end up having more purposeful engagement, a really great question is, were they like that throughout the life course? Did the seeds for that, get planted in adolescence, in early adulthood? Was there transformation along the way? Those are just foundational life course questions. Yeah, Rich.
So, I'm a developmental psychologist, so I apologize for bringing the conversation back to the concept of development. I want to remind people that the concept of development is not an empirical concept. Development is a theoretical concept. And our job as developmentalists, for those of us in the room who are developmentalists, is to discern from the ebb and flow of the changes in the world, those changes which fit our theoretically predicated conception of development. I'd like to posit that although we all admit, and even behavior geneticists, who are not developmentalists, but even behavior geneticists would admit that human behavior involves person-context relations. How do we discriminate between the changes that are involved in the ubiquitous person-context relations that are involved in everyday life, those changes which fit development, which conform to a notion of development? I would argue that without a concept of purpose, we have no definition of development. How do we go into a system of exchanges between an organism and a world, mutually influential, and say those are the changes that we will look at and say that they are developmental changes? And it's because we have some notion of where those changes are headed, the goal, the purpose of those changes, to develop health, to develop a sense of well-being, to develop a sense of meaning in life, an identity, to pass a criterion for intellectual achievement. Without purpose, we have no way of judging those changes which fit the progressive and the successive and progressive alterations across time and place that are development. So if that is the case, then purpose becomes a defining feature of any concept of development. And to say that development, therefore, is aimed at negative things conflates the notion of change with the notion of this idealized conception we have of development. I'm sounding a lot like Heinz Werner, Piaget, all of the classic developmental theorists here. And I'm also channeling my colleague Bill Damon. Having a purpose per se, without a notion of successive changes that are leading to some desired, valued, culturally communitarian, valued end state is not development. It's change, but the idea that people who want to blow up other people are somehow having a purpose, they're interested in changing, but they're not developmentally changing. Because development is a theoretical term aimed at human changes that are moving towards a valued end state. You could say, I don't agree with those values, but you'll have to substitute other values. You can talk about change, but you can't be a developmentalist and talk about ISIS or cancer or deterioration because of Alzheimer's. That is not development. Development is successive and progressive changes towards some valued end state. That's what development is. If you don't like it, don't be a developmentalist. But if you are a developmentalist, you have to talk about the sort of purposes that Bill Damon has championed in terms of his work about noble or positive purpose. So to me, given that, what Carol is doing is documenting the very fact that if you take a developmental perspective, you're going to see systematic and progressive changes. Progressive is an important word here. Progress towards a positive end state that will lead towards a valued end state. So the whole idea of this meeting of purpose and health is a given if one is a developmental scientist. If you're not a developmental scientist, you could say, well, you can have changes that lead to destruction. Yeah, but that's not development. So if you don't want to study that, don't be a developmentalist. But if you want to be a developmentalist, we have to accept the inherent connection between progressive and systematic changes in a bidirectionally influential system between organism and context, leading to health and positive outcomes.
So Richard, maybe I'm not that smart and I'm not a developmentalist, but don't you think that ISIS, if you talk to many people in ISIS, they feel like there is some sort of progress they're trying to make, or that Adolf Hitler
You can't separate the notion of purpose from the notion of the Aristotelian virtues. Adolf Eichmann had great purpose. He got the trains to run on time, he put Jews in them, and he sent them to the ovens.
I get it.
That was purpose, but was he working in a way that reflected anything that people would say is a positive outcome? What we're talking about here is what Marvin Berkowitz, who's arguably the leading person in character education in the country, if not the world, says that any rational person would say serves both the individual and the context in mutually beneficial relations. So all human functioning involves bidirectional relations.
So what you're saying, though, is that an evil purpose is not a purpose.
No,
what you're saying?
I'm saying it is not a purpose that moves towards a developmental end state, which is one that is defined by mutually beneficial relations between an individual and a context. Now, you may not like that, but I'm defining, development is not an empirical concept, it's a theoretical concept. I'm talking about the nature of what we think of as human development. If you don't like it, don't do development.
I actually really like Carol's response to it, though, when you brought it back to Aristotle, because I think what we're really saying is it's not just important to have purpose, it's important to have an educated purpose, a purpose where you have actually considered...
A moral purpose.
And I would say...
Considered ethics, and you've considered character.
Yeah, exactly.
Those are very important aspects and dimensions
Exactly.
as you build your...
which I would say a lot of traditional theories of development never touch. So, I mean, you know, I went to graduate school in a place where there was an enormous amount of emphasis, as Rich knows, on what's the difference between change and development. And I spent enormous amounts of time thinking about those issues, teaching new generations of students about those issues. And I would have to say, at some point, I just kind of stepped away from a fair amount of that because I think maybe I became less of a developmentalist. Clearly, I care about human betterment, and clearly I care about well-lived lives. I think the questions about the parts, maybe I would say, Rich, that and let me say, nobody was talking purpose in life back then. Nobody. Nobody. You were there, not in any of the lifespan developmental training. Nobody talked purpose. Nobody.
Because it was lifespan human development, BD, before they were.
Yeah, right. So, but I would say the part I've come back to over time is I very much resonate to your emphasis on the importance of having ideal end states. I believe in ideal end states. I don't think purpose is the only one.
No, purpose is a moderator of moving towards a positive end state.
Well, we can quibble about it, but I think the idea of pushing yourself to articulate ideal end states is worthy. I'm thankful. Some people knock themselves out doing that. Thank you. Okay, I think we've probably had enough.
Absolutely. I think this goes to show how easy of a concept we're grappling with, right? We can get to easy answers and there's no problem. Everything's wrapped up tidy at the end. When in fact, perhaps the opposite is true. That these are difficult topics to grapple with and to come to any conclusion, at least immediately. But I think asking the question is what this is about. And I guarantee you that the people who are absorbing this and grappling with it appreciate the fact we're asking questions about this. So join me in thanking Dr. Riff. I want to say that I think this lays the tracks for what we're in for the next couple of days. So many things came up in the slides that I think we're going to hear some follow-up on in the individual talks given tomorrow and the following day. I keep forgetting to say this. Over here on your way out of the room, there's a folder that has the agenda of speakers and some other information about our conference, but also the area as well. So please pick up a folder with us tomorrow. Tomorrow we begin at 8 a.m. I believe it is. In the room. 8:30. 8:30. Okay. Yes. Yeah. I'm on East Coast time. Yes. 8:30. 8:30 in the room next door. So we're not in here. We're in the room next door, and join us for breakfast. We'll see you in the morning.